Yeah, we've got a Q&A session, and I think maybe that floating mic can still be floating to people who ask questions. And then I'm going to hand this mic to Ajahn Karunadhammo because I've been doing a lot of talking, so I can listen to Ajahn Cunda and Ajahn Karunadhammo answer questions.
One thing that did come up in our group that wasn't mentioned was getting stuck in thoughts. So getting caught in just a lot of thinking and absorbed in the thoughts, sort of identifying with them in meditation, it comes up and you just can't stop thinking about it. And one thing that was mentioned was like utilizing the contemplation of the elements to get back in the body and get out of the thoughts. But my question is, when you've got this stream of thought going, you can't get out of it, or perhaps you have an emotion going, you can't seem to get out of it, and how to extract yourself from that thinking, it's a very basic question, distraction and all these things, but what are your recommendations?
Okay. It doesn't necessarily get any better when you get older either, just or after meditating for many years. That's any solace. I think, it's a little bit off the topic of the day, but that's great. This is a time to explore whatever comes across. And thinking is, the goal of the practice is not to stop thinking. I think sometimes we get kind of caught up in that as a paradigm. And, we do hear teachings that say, as the concentration or samadhi starts to deepen, then thoughts will start to subside, and second jhana, there's no vitaka vichara happening, that kind of stuff. So sometimes people think that's the goal, is to get rid of thinking. But if you go into it with that kind of attitude, it's probably just going to rebound, because the energy of aversion to thinking will just fuel it probably all that much more. So more important than the fact that there may be some nattering going on in kind of constant, motion, it's more important to kind of go beneath that and see what the underlying state of mind is, and to work with that as a hindrance. And then, whatever happens with that verbal process in the head as a result of that investigation is what happens. And if the thinking kind of continues on, that's what's happening. The famous quote from Ajahn Chah, when he said something like, there's only one person who doesn't think, and that's a dead person. So keeping that in mind, that the nature of the intellect, the nature of that part of the active part of mind, manas, the intellect, is to produce thoughts. It's the vaci sankhara. So just as the nature of the heart is to beat, and the body, the lungs, is to breathe, the nature of the mind is to think. So just because thinking is going on doesn't mean that there's something wrong. But trying not to get lost too much in a story. If we're dealing with some sort of afflictive mind state, there's unpleasantness and there's a lot of churning going on that can exacerbate the underlying state of, say, anger or aversion or desire or whatever the underlying state is. Proliferative thinking kind of amps it up. So to just gently set aside the story and the thinking, let it go on, but kind of remove your attention from it and move your attention to that layer of underlying tendency, underlying emotion that can be felt most usefully in the body. So returning to the experience of the body to say, okay, what's the underlying hindrance or emotion here? Is it aversion? Is it ill will? Is it out and out anger? Is it desire, wanting, anxiety, fear? What's going on underneath, and experience it on the level of the body. And just kind of let the story move into the background, but don't try and obliterate it. So, you just don't want to add a layer of aversion to thinking by thinking it shouldn't be there. I wish I would stop thinking, because that just compounds the problem. So that was part of the question. I don't know if was there another part of that? No,
that was a good answer. Thank you.
Okay.
My question is sort of the inverse of that, which is when I'm sitting, the mind is relatively still. It's not sleepy, it's alert, but it's not quiet enough to pick up an object of contemplation. If I try to think about or try to just hold an object of contemplation, I can't stay on it. So I might have even asked you this before.
Probably.
But I need help again.
Well, you probably have heard an answer from me, so I'll toss it over to Ajahn Cunda for a fresh viewpoint.
So it's the experiences that you do experience some stillness, but you sounds like you're interested in kind of bringing that stillness into contemplating, kind of like what we've been, just one of the elements, or it could be anything, right? There could be any kind of contemplation you are thinking of trying out. And so my guess is that it's a lack of interest. You're not, is that right? Like you're not really finding like, oh, I don't want to do that. Oh, it's not really interesting. So your mind's not kind of attracted to that investigation that you're trying to bring up, at least.
Well, I don't force it to pick a topic. I don't have a topic that I feel I have to. I just feel like I should use that quiet time, that stillness, to understand something.
Mm-hmm. Do you try to understand the stillness itself?
Sometimes I think it's okay to just let myself enjoy it.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's all right too. One of the things that's coming out is just you're talking about a desire, like you're wanting to use something for something else. And so what's just coming out at me is that investigation of desire can be that object. Okay, like I want something and it's not working out how I want it. I'd like to have this come up. I'd like to have something I'm interested in. I'd like to use this quiet for something. And so I'm guessing there's a little bit of frustration because you're asking the question. So I think that's kind of the first part of an investigation is kind of looking at like, well, what's wrong with this experience? Why am I finding something wrong with this? What is it that, and then really trying to investigate desire around that. Like, is this the Buddha's, second teaching, in terms of the second noble truth? He says desire is the cause of dukkha. So I'm desiring something and I am experiencing dukkha because of that desire. And how is that occurring? What's that like? What is that like? So that's something you could get interested in because it's sort of right there up front with like your attempt to understand why won't my mind kind of pick something up? It's so still. So I think that's a helpful investigation because if it's quiet, then you can see that. If there's that stillness, then you're able to kind of be with that experience. And again, as we've been talking about, utilizing the body for that. What is that visceral sense that you're feeling? When that frustration is coming up. So I think my point is there's room for contemplation even about not being able to contemplate. So that's a possibility. The other thing is that you could, if you aren't, wanting to just enjoy the stillness that you're talking about, then another thing you can do is kind of push yourself a little. So you can say, okay, like what is something that seems to be coming up right now that I'm not interested in, and it's okay that I'm not interested in. I'm going to try and pursue it anyway. And so what that might do is push through a resistance that you're putting up, like almost a denial. Like, oh, I don't want that, I don't want this, I don't want to do this. And so it's almost like this list of what I don't want to do. And then you just kind of push through that. You say, okay, I'm going to ignore that. Maybe that's not actually helping me. This kind of, the best thing for me is, I can't find it. So then you say, okay, I'm going to ignore that voice and like just try something even if I'm not interested in it. So like, for example, we're talking about the elements and somebody might actually feel that they have no interest in the elements. There's nothing there for me. I don't find anything helpful. And you kind of touch into one of them, but then you say, okay, I'm just going to try one out, and you start kind of thinking like, what is the earth element? What does that mean? What is that solidity, that stableness, that kind of reminder of earth, and then you try that out. So you push yourself into something that maybe you don't want to do and see what happens. see if the mind keeps resisting, then there's a good object too. What is up with all this resistance? So those are just some suggestions for me. It's sometimes encouraging ourselves in a way that we fall into certain patterns, and then we just take sometimes like the easier way, like, oh, okay, yeah, this keeps happening, I'm not interested. So that becomes sort of the problem then, is that we kind of take the side of that disinterest rather than kind of moving against it, so that we can kind of push through. Those are just a couple of ideas.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, ditto everything Ajahn Cunda said, and particularly at the beginning when he was saying, like looking at the desire for thinking that something should be happening or that I should be investigating, just to investigate that itself, in and of itself too. And then adding to what he was saying about, first of all, for yourself to differentiate between that kind of stillness or peacefulness can often come in kind of different aspects or different qualities. One can be one that's slightly dull, but still very relaxing, very pleasant, it's nice to be here, but maybe not with a lot of extreme acuteness and alertness and clarity of mind. And then, if that's the case, then that's a very, very subtle hindrance of like dullness and drowsiness, the third hindrance. If there's absolute clarity and, it feels like really firm samadhi and very peaceful, then the Buddha says that's a blameless kind of pleasure, and developing that kind of calmness and clarity of mind. As long as there's pure mindfulness, alertness, clear comprehension, then that's good too. And also a lot of the Kruba Ajahns emphasize that's a real easy place to get stuck because it is so pleasant. And the tendency is to just be quite satisfied with that. So if you're someone who hasn't actually, completely developed and with piercing insight the nature of the body as, transient and not self, and if you're not completely free from all attachment and clinging to this body, then it's time to turn your contemplations, enjoy the peace and the samadhi, but use it for really investigating the body. I think I'm probably a little bit influenced by the fact that I'm just about to finish a biography of Ajahn Jia. And, his practice was just constantly for many years contemplating the body and, taking it apart and chopping it up into pieces. And, he was quite drastic in some ways, but, just his way of, this relentless investigation of the parts of the body to try and detach himself from this self-involvement of this body as mine or me or some even subtle form of identification with it. And, the 32 parts contemplations, the elements, the illness, the aging, those kind of, just to pick them up, because unless you're completely free from attachment to the body, you need to develop the insight around that, to fully let go of that attachment and to experience the freedom that comes from that. And again, the samadhi, if it's that clear, alert, bright samadhi, is great, and enjoy it, but don't get lost in it. You need to turn your attention, if I may say so, because we're in the same boat, you and I, you're not getting any younger. So while you've still got your faculties and some meditation, it's time to turn your attention to that development of that insight.
So a question around sickness, I guess. There was an interesting comment made in our group that got me reflecting, and sort of my context that I'll add is that, we think of aging and sickness as something that sort of is natural, and it happens to us, right? And someone made a comment that was around, it sounded like they had an sort of more active part in something that happened to them, like, oh, I did this and then it happened, and why did I do that kind of thing. And the reflection that came up for me was when it's more like one had some, this isn't the right way to put it, but had some clear active part in something that happened to one. And then the extra dukkha that comes on top of that because it wasn't I guess I'll say wholly outside of one's control, sort of, although that's not accurate either. But the point is when one does something that brings on there's a direct and more obvious cause that one had a part in, and then the dukkha that comes with that. So relative to a sickness or an injury. So I was just curious if there's any reflection on the things that sort of don't just happen to us. Does that make sense?
Well, you're saying things that have a more clear, direct,
yes,
memorable cause.
Yes, that one might have had a part in.
And that one has a regret about it afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll start and then pass it on. Yeah, I mean, it's just the whole thing of looking back and recognizing when one, makes an error in judgment, makes a mistake, the whole regret, remorse aspect of it, which is a useful when it's done in a healthy way. It's looking back and saying, okay, I did this, or I spoke in this way, or I acted in this way, and this contributed to this really unpleasant thing that I'm experiencing now. So maybe that wasn't really a great thing to do. I recognize that, I take ownership of that, I admit it, and I, resolve not to do that same thing again in the future. So that's a kind of reflection is healthy. It's a regret because you're realizing there was something unskillful and that you have this motivation. You suffered the consequences of it and you have this motivation to do different in the future. And then the hard part is leaving it there and not going back and rehashing, because that's where it becomes kind of toxic. So you've done your business, you've owned up to it, you've made a resolution. That's enough. Okay, I can see the consequences of this. And then you say, okay, that was then, this is now. The past is the past. I can relive it and just add that second, third, fourth, fifth layer of suffering over and over and over again, but it doesn't go towards resolving it. And, it's like we have this notion from, Western or Judeo-Christian upbringing, that the more we suffer and inflict guilt on ourselves regarding something like that, then somehow we'll, be more absolved, or that, that it will all go away and, justice will be done, and something like that. But that's not a very healthy ethic according to the Buddhist tradition. That doesn't fly. It just compounds the problem. The more negative attention, the more self-blaming, that's just another form of aversion heaped onto the whole thing. So to be able to just really practice with seeing yourself as if you were maybe advising somebody else, with a heart of compassion. Some friend of yours was telling you something like this. You wouldn't probably say to that person, keep suffering with it. Think about it over and over again. Blame yourself. You were wrong. You really, you're really a, a basket case. It's hopeless. Forget it. You wouldn't say that to somebody. So why do you say it to yourself?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything Ajahn Karunadhammo said there. I think that also just seeing it as habit, sort of just like we see the resolution of feeling negatively about ourselves as feeling more negatively about ourselves. That's like the resolution is, if I blame myself, I'll get better. At least that's what is going on when it happens. It might sound really idiotic, but it's like, this is how I'll resolve things, by telling myself how much of an idiot I am. And it's unfortunate because, as Ajahn Karunadhammo was saying, it's just like compounding more and more negativity and aversion. And when I say it's a habit, the things that's harder to turn towards, which Ajahn Karunadhammo was also talking about, is emphasizing learning. And so even in our practice, just we think about like samadhi or working in that element. It's like, oh, I just want to be peaceful and concentrate, right, and get my mind peaceful. But it's not like sometimes turn towards learning. How can I benefit from understanding this? Or as Lumpur Sumedho says, standing under dukkha. So we're really trying to switch that habit of guilt and beating ourselves up. And telling ourselves how wrong we are to, okay, like, can I put that down, acknowledging that there was something wrong that was done, and really see like, okay, how can I understand this? How can I learn from it? And genuinely trying to shift that habit towards learning over and over again. so that the habit of aversion gets taken over by the habit of learning and interest. If we aren't able to switch that over, then we're just stuck in the same cycle. And learning, I think one of the reasons that learning is difficult is it takes a lot of work. There's a lot of kind of put an effort to push ourselves into, okay, but how can I understand this? How can I learn from this experience? And that's a different mode for us. And so I'm using the word habit because I think when our habit is not to immediately turn towards that, but instead just kind of get stuck in sort of self-annihilation and flagellation, the sense is we're not developing that skill of insight, understanding, and learning. And so it's really trying to see and clarify for ourselves, like encourage ourselves towards that, and find that voice that Ajahn Karunadhammo was talking about, that friend who's going to encourage us in that direction as well.
Just one more thought that came up in addition to the Ajahn Chunda's suggestion of kind of learning how to learn, which I think is really important. But also just developing a spacious quality of mind that can receive the memories from the past and the regrets in a much broader space of mind. Because oftentimes that self-judgmental state of mind is very constricted, very narrow, and doesn't see a lot beyond itself. And when past regrets are coming up and that kind of motion in mind is running full tilt, then developing very broad, boundless, or moving towards boundless, but broader states of mind, like, kindness, compassion for oneself and for the process that's going on, just gives it more space. You just want to expand your ability to regard the memories or the regrets that are coming up with a broader state of mind. It's like that simile of the Buddha's that remembering something or experiencing essentially the karma of some action can be compared to salt in water. If you have a glass of water and you put a teaspoon of salt in it and drink the water or taste the water, you're going to taste that salt very clearly. But if you put the same teaspoon of salt into the river Ganges, it was the example, or some large body of water, and take a taste of it, you're not going to taste it. So the salt is still there, the effects may still be there, but the experience of it is much reduced because you have a much broader container of mind to hold it in.
Thanks. I have a quick lead-in and then a question. Recently, I read a science paper about scientists, researchers studying dandelions, and they grew them up to be very sickly, and they were malnourished, and they didn't get enough nutrients or sunlight. And their interest was in their progeny, in the next generation of dandelions, that also, even with better conditions, still exhibited a lot of the very same characteristics of the parent generation. And I bring this up because in conversation with friends in Sangha, many of us inherit the same, say, scarcity mindset from parents that came here after World War I or whenever, or this idea of lots of judgment or maybe anger, like generational anger. And some of it's righteous, but to honor my ancestors, but at the same time not keep that cycle going. That's my question. If Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, if there's a way to attend to that skillfully.
Well, the thought that comes up for me is hopefully in an evolutionary sense, we're a little bit more advanced than dandelions. So, but yeah, it does show that there is something, we inherit massive amounts of traits. We inherit many, many traits from our parents, and not just physical traits, but emotional and mental traits as well. So, and they say, I think I hear this a lot, like trauma takes 4 generations to wear out. So, I guess unless it's renewed. So, but I think we could probably, like those dandelions that were born sickly, even under better conditions, I think we could do a little bit better than them in terms of we could reflect on our conditions and try to make the most of the situation And so we might be born under those more adverse conditions, or our genes might be affected by our ancestors. And even though we're born in better conditions, we carry over things that they've experienced in their lives. But dandelions also can't reflect in the same way that we can. So they're just going to be inheriting those conditions. But we might inherit the same conditions, but I think we can reflect on it and we can actually take it the other direction. So our ancestors may have had scarcity mentality or whatever, but we can actually take it in the other direction so that then we pass on the opposite traits than that, because it's not like the parents or the ancestors were, say, born with that from their parents. They just maybe experienced it through. Maybe they were okay. Maybe their parents were okay, but then they developed these things based on living through world wars or whatever. So we can take it the other way. We can move it back in the positive direction. Even though we may be affected by our parents and ancestors, we can actually use the Dhamma, use the precepts, use our practice to move it in another direction. So I think it can go both ways.
Just to add to that, just a reflection about karma, the law of karma, in that, just as Ajahn Nyaniko was pointing to, it's like we may inherit something or inherit a tendency or a viewpoint or a way of looking at things, and whether it's an inherited tendency, say, that we've picked up from family or conditioning in this lifetime, or something that we've brought with us from previous lifetimes, tendencies towards certain mind states or mind habits. We do have to, in a sense, deal with the results that come from that kind of past. But in this moment, just as Ajahn Nyaniko was referring to, we have the ability to change that. That's part of the law of karma too, that even though we can't necessarily obliterate past karma, we experience it, the effects of it in some way. In this moment, and the Buddha teaches us very directly in some of his teachings, in this moment, we have the ability to readjust. And by the way that we pay appropriate attention, yoniso manasikara is our tool that we use so that we don't attend inappropriately and compound the problem by just kind of reliving and rehashing and reinvigorating the old beliefs or mind states or memes or whatever it is. But we recognize when that's unskillful or when it's just resulting in compounding it, as he was saying, and then just we do have this capacity as human beings to reflect and change and apply our attention in a different way. What did the Buddha say? The Buddha says, what we think about and ponder about frequently becomes the inclination of our mind. So we need to attend appropriately.
Just one comment to that is there's something that we're practicing with right now in the community. We're having classes around speech, and one of the ways we're doing that is with Marshall Rosenberg's NVC. And so one of the recent chapters we've been studying is about responsibility and how easy it is to deny responsibility in terms of our actions, and then like how we express that through speech. I had to, you made me do it, things like that, or you made me feel angry, something like that. So that's a big element is like, again, the influence might be there, our habits might be there, moving us in a particular direction, as both Ajahn Karunadhammo and Ajahn Nyaniko were talking about. But then we can continue to remind ourselves that it is our responsibility to change. We have that not only ability, but that reminder to kind of rise up and come out of the muck of our past. And that's not easy, it's a very difficult thing, because it's just much easier to follow our habits and patterns that are already ingrained within us. So just making that effort and to kind of know when we're doing something in an unskillful way, and then reminding ourselves, okay, I actually have a choice, and that's very empowering. It's very empowering to kind of remind ourselves, I can make a decision here for myself that's different than what I really want to do. I want to actually do something unskillful. So I think that taking responsibility really it sort of forces us to really to veer away from like feeling disempowered and like I don't have any choice here, and it's just up to my past karma and my relatives and all these things. And I think most people in a certain way express that in one way or another. There's some sort of shifting the blame or responsibility, and I think that's quite common. So not to find that as a thing of like, why do I do that? But more just, it's just a normal thing that's present within us. And then that taking responsibility really ups that kind of effort we can make, even though again it's very difficult. It's just so much very worth it.
Yeah, I like the word responsibility, because it just, when you think about it, it just means you have the ability to respond, and as opposed to reactivity. So looking at responsibility rather than reactivity, I think, is a useful way to frame it.
May I ask a question? Is there time? So this is going back a little bit more to the theme of the day. Can you suggest both some attitudes and some direct ways of working with intense bodily pain? I've had intense bodily pain in the form of childbirth and worked with it quite successfully, but I'm not sure the same methods would apply.
So you're saying that from childbirth, meaning?
Meaning that I was able to, I noticed in the course of giving birth to 2 children, I noticed immediately what was not successful in coping with pain, and what was not successful was any distraction, like the thought, oh, I did this before, I don't really want to do it again, and then boom.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that, there are a lot of things about childbirth that equip a person to handle it. And in other kinds of pain, I have an apprehension about, physical illness or injury that I feel like I want to be cultivating some ways of dealing skillfully should that arise.
Well, believe it or not, I've never given childbirth, so I've never given birth before. So but it's said to be. I also haven't passed a kidney stone, which is said to be the equivalent for men on the male side. So I can't quite answer the intensity of that. However, I think that it's very much a part of human experience to have to go through some sort of extreme pain at some point. Some people have that or don't. Surely a death, it's usually not a very pleasant thing, although that's not what everybody experiences in their death. But one thing to say is, well, you've done it twice. So you're definitely more experienced than I am. And that kind of extreme pain, it's also quite wonderful. You went through it, and however you coped with it, it's sort of that old thing that we hear from Lumpur Sumedho is I can't bear it, I can't bear it, I can't bear it. But then the whole time that you're saying that, you're actually bearing it. So it's important to remember that, you did get through it. Maybe your idea was that you'd like to have had it been more successful, or that it lingers as something that was traumatic and you have an aversion to it, as you're saying. So that lingering kind of then continues to kind of fester in terms of I'm afraid of it happening again, that kind of pain or illness or death. I think that most of our practice is our attempt to come into the body rather than recede from it, as you're talking about, like a distraction. And so there are different ways for doing that, but there's also only so much time that a person can take when they're dealing with pain to not be distracted, to not, try other, ways of just reacting to it because it's so intense, it's traumatic. So also forgiving ourselves for maybe not being equipped for handling such extreme pain, and knowing that that's just kind of what happens. The ability to cope at certain levels is just not necessarily there for, I think, most human beings. At the same time, so for example, when people are dying, it's not like the Buddhist suggestion for them, when I experience great pain, when I'm such intense pain and my mind is all over the place when I'm dying, I shouldn't take any medication, right, to allay the pain. And that's not necessarily what I would teach or what I've heard other senior monks teach. And it's like, no, there's a certain element of goodness that comes from alleviating some pain that is one can't actually cope with. But we sometimes think, no, I have to be the hero. I have to be able to deal with this just myself. And but that can bring up all kinds of problems. There is a particular method that I use with pain that I find is very helpful with that coping strategy, and that is that if something is very intense for me, and again, I don't know if this would work with childbirth, but I just focus on some area of my experience, my body that I feel that feels pleasant. Somewhere that there's a relaxation in a joint or a hand or my hand or my shoulder or whatever, something that isn't in that amount of pain. And that seems to, for me, drop about 20 or 30% of the pain. It just like diminishes it, because the attention, the pain is still there, but the attention is focused on the pleasantness. And so sometimes we have to kind of retreat like that when we're with our practice, because that's how we're able to cope. Okay, I can be with this pain at like 70%, so I'll do that. And that's not, it doesn't have to be like a heroic response, like, no, I have to do this, because I think that's just stupidity, just forcing ourselves to do something that we can't necessarily cope with. Over time, that might actually deal with that anxiety or help with that anxiety and allow you to figure out what you're able to cope with. But I think coming back to our theme, it's really like the body. How often can we just seep ourselves in the body, be really kind of bringing our attention over and over back to it, so it doesn't become a source of dread or fear or pain for us. It becomes something very familiar, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. And the more that we have that as a response for ourselves, then we're able to kind of utilize that, so it becomes very normal. It's like, okay, I normally just keep coming back to this, and my pathway is then not to run away from the body, it's to move towards it, even when it's unpleasant. But that's like, it's kind of like learning to do lots of push-ups. Like you don't start with 100, and you start with a few or 5 or 10 or whatever, and then you keep building up. So with the body, to get to, let's say, be able to cope with a great pain like that, I think it just takes a lot of experience of dealing with pain within the body. But I'm not saying you should cause pain in order to do that. So you don't have to practice it that way. And that's my response.